Today, we're going to revisit an issue which percolated in 2020 and eventually devolved into a scandal of sorts, the so-called We Charity scandal. Remember that? You might recall the headlines. A Canadian-based international charity became embroiled in a scandal when it was selected to administer a $912 million Canadian Student Service Grant program during COVID. This turned into a media firestorm with allegations of cronyism, improper lobbying, payments to the family of the Prime Minister Trudeau, and to cap it off, an ethics committee hearing. I could go on and on. But what ensued was a media firestorm. But did we actually get the facts right? It was highly reported and publicized, but did the media fall short of letting the public know what it was really all about? What type of power and influence can the media have, and, well, how do we wield it? Our guest for today is Tawfiq Rangwala. He is a lawyer, a former board member of We Charity, and the author of a book called What We Lost: Inside the Attack on Canada's Largest Children's Charity. Tawfiq is going to give us today's Counterpoint. Welcome, Tawfiq. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so now, before we delve into some of the particulars of We Charity, could you provide the viewers a little bit about your background and why you decided to write this book?
Sure. So I'm a lawyer by trade, and I think that's really important. I'm certainly not an author, and I wasn't looking to write a book. This is a book I, in many ways, felt compelled to write. I practice law. I'm Canadian by background, proud Canadian, but I've been practicing law for over 20 years. I'm a law firm partner in a firm called Milbank and a litigator by trade in the U.S., based out of New York. And what I do for a living is I represent individuals and institutions who are being investigated by the government in some way. And I also handle internal investigations and all sorts of civil litigation, often involving, issues like financial fraud and, financial services and corruption, bribery, but also things like Me Too and cultural issues. And so I was on the board of We Charity for about 4 to 5 years. I've known the Kielburgers, who are the founders of We Charity, since they were relatively young, and they asked me to join the board on the U.S. board because I think they wanted more of a U.S. presence, and the board wanted more of, a law firm partner type individual who can help guide the charity at that time. So that's me and how I got on the board. But how I ended up writing the book was basically, as I say in the book, I had a backstage pass and a front row seat to what was the We Charity scandal, and I served on the board throughout it. And I think it was such a soul-shattering, difficult time, in part because of the extent of what I would call fog and misinformation in the Canadian public space about We Charity and the roots and genesis of the scandal. And so, as the dust slowly started to settle, I just felt like I was uniquely positioned to tell this story from an insider's perspective and try and give Canadians maybe some missing ingredients that they didn't know about to reevaluate what happened and to ask hard questions about politics and the media.
Absolutely. I remember when, again, this issue erupted, and I did probably about 3, maybe even 4 shows on this so-called alleged scandal. And, there was information coming at us each way. Journalists were finding all sorts of things. It just snowballed. So I'm really excited that you're here because not only did you have, as you said, a backstage pass front row seat, but also your professional background. You're used to doing this for a living to investigate if there was impropriety and fraud. So I really do appreciate this. So what did you learn in your research?
Well, what I really learned in my research is that in many ways, the We Charity scandal was manufactured as it related to we, and really wasn't about We Charity, or shouldn't have been, let me say it that way, about We Charity as much as it was, a politically driven scandal designed to tarnish and bring down the Trudeau government. And, whether you think that's deserved or undeserved is sort of besides the point. But it was clear that the agenda of people across the political spectrum, both on the right and the left, was to try and throw some sand, if you will, at the Liberal government and Justin Trudeau during the middle of the pandemic, and to suggest that there had been, ethics violations in the way that the Canada Student Service Grant program had been awarded to We Charity to administer that program. And We Charity, meanwhile, was sort of sitting in the background, basically trying to put together a program for 100,000 students in the middle of the first summer of COVID, designed to try and help young people find opportunities and jobs and connect with nonprofits. And it was doing that work. And suddenly, accusations against Justin Trudeau or Bill Morneau or members of the Liberal government quickly turned into a label called the We Charity scandal. And it invited, I think, politicians and journalists to sort of look at the charity and sort of criticize and unpack it in every possible way.
I'm going to pause you there. I have to cut to commercial. We'll pick this right back up. Welcome back. I'm joined again by Tawfiq Rangwala. We're discussing his book, What We Lost Inside the Attack on Canada's Largest Children's Charity. Thank you again for joining me. Before we went to commercial break, we were discussing how this really was it was a political issue, but potentially We Charity got just snarled into it. There was a lot of political capital lost from the Liberals, primarily. Justin Trudeau, I recall that they're after him to testify at the Ethics Committee. Our Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau, was caught up in all of this and actually resigned amidst all of these investigations. What was that all about?
Well, if you look at it, I mean, what the accusation was, right, against Trudeau and Bill Morneau was that they had ties to We Charity and that they had, appeared on the stage at We Charity events. They visited We Charity projects internationally, at least in the case of Morneau. And I think the allegation was, they were too close. And the issue really for politicians was, should those members of cabinet have recused themselves from the decision to award this contract to We Charity? And what I point out in the book is I think many people sort of maligned We Charity for that. But of course, We Charity had no visibility into whether these people recused themselves. We Charity assumed that if they needed to recuse themselves, they had done so. It never even entered, the mind of We Charity to try and get involved in the government's policing of its own conflicts of interest. It was sort of like We Charity, as Kim Campbell says in the introduction to the book, of the foreword, We Charity thought it was called to serve, and it felt compelled because its raison d'etre was putting young people together with volunteering opportunities. That's what it did for 25 years in Canada. That's why it was celebrated. It felt compelled to serve. It never felt that it was its job to sort of police whether the government was doing everything it was supposed to do, or whether there was some invitation to criticize the government for how it was, awarding the program. We Charity was focused on just doing the work. And, Tanya, what was really interesting politically in this story was, for me, what happened is, I think, is a lot of politicians, it wasn't enough to have a scandal, an ethics scandal in the Trudeau government, if We Charity was a good actor. I mean, if the Liberal government was giving the money, let's just say to Mother Teresa or some other revered figure, but it cut corners on ethics rules, that's really not enough of a scandal. To make it a scandal and really question Trudeau's judgment, you had to make We Charity in some way a bad actor. It had to be a problem to award administration to this organization. And I think that's where politicians, really deeply unfairly, I think, on both sides of the spectrum, and the media following suit, took up an invitation to sort of tar We Charity, criticize the founders of We Charity, sort of look at them with a critical lens, and losing sight of the real political problem, mostly because the politicians wanted to make it about how could you, the Trudeau government, give money to this organization, right? It only works, it's only a scandal if you gave money to something sinister.
Now, you mentioned in your book that I'll call it an alleged We Charity scandal, for lack of a better phrase. This was percolating before we even knew about it, perhaps before even the politicians knew about it, that there was a media influence that kind of brought this to the forefront. Are you able to discuss what that was all about? Because many of us have no idea about that.
Well, look, I think that, We Charity and the Kielburgers, the Craig and Mark Kielburger who founded it, I think have always been media darlings in Canada for almost 25 years. I mean, they very much, been celebrated for a lot of their achievements and for what they've done in the Canadian charitable landscape. And one of the really interesting elements of this story, what makes it interesting, whatever side of the equation you come out on, is just how quickly they turned into pariahs, how quickly the Canadian public, media, and politicians all turned on them. And I think, there had always been media outlets, mostly fringe players, heavily focused on social media, that have been critical of We Charity and asked questions about it, or raised all sorts of skepticism and doubt about it. And those have been addressed. From my perspective as a board member, all of those kinds of concerns have always been addressed. And if they were fair, they were taken into account, and if they were unfair, they were rebutted. But really, the mainstream media really had never focused in a critical way on We Charity. And I think what happened here is there was a bit of what I call piling on, where people became much more interested in the questions and not very interested in the answers. And there was a tendency to like report smoke and then decide it's not really worth telling your viewers whether there's fire. And I think it was a real failure in my mind of investigative journalism, where I think a lot of mainstream media started taking their cues from social media players and fringe players and then reporting their narrative as the story, as opposed to sort of asking hard questions. Is the story fair? Is it justified? And
Right.
more importantly, to the title of my book, are the losses and what's been lost, is it worth it? And is it just? And I
Right.
think people ignored those questions.
Okay, we're going to pick up this discussion in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're discussing the We Charity alleged scandal that happened in 2020 and what has come out of that. Was it really a scandal? What responsibility do us in the media play for maybe a big pylon that maybe there was just no fire when we reported smoke? Well, joining me again is Tawfiq Rangwala, who's the author of a book on the devolvement of the scandal. And again, thank you so much for joining me. So before we went for commercial break, we're discussing, again, this allegation that perhaps there was only ever smoke and not fire. And, I'm a journalist. I do my very best to fact check, but the news cycle moves so quickly. And when journalists are reporting certain things, you expect that they have done their due diligence. And when we bring them on as guests, we bring them on as an expert and we ask the questions. So I guess my question to you then is, do journalists have a misinformation problem?
Well, I think they do. I think this story reveals that some of our most, venerated sources of news, in Canada, including the CBC, I think there's a real tendency to just assume that journalists have done their homework and that if they're presenting it to you, that they've already done the background work, they've checked with the sources, they've looked into it. And I think what this scandal revealed to me in a very powerful way that I didn't appreciate, I must say, was that that's just often not the case. And particularly when you have a fast moving story where there is a real interest level in understanding what's going on, I think there's a real tendency, a drive towards sensationalism. And when people ask for corrections or when people point out that, the story is not being covered accurately, I think there's a real tendency to gloss over that or to skip over what I would call the boring parts. One thing I'll just say, Tanya, and I'll let you ask a question is, for me, one of the motivations in writing this book is there was almost no mention by the media. And 125,000 articles, no mention of children, teachers, students, or impoverished people in communities around the world. In other words, no one cared in the media about the beneficiaries of We Charity. So if you look at all the reporting, it's basically saying, well, this is an interesting political story. What did We Charity do? Let's talk about these Kielburger brothers. But the question of what about 7,000 schools in Canada that lost mental health programming because We Charity in Canada had to close? What about thousands of Indigenous people who don't have suicide prevention treatment anymore? What about millions of children in Kenya or Ecuador and India who don't have access to clean drinking water anymore as a result of political choices in Canada? And the media really just entirely ignored that question. For 25 years, millions of Canadian young people and teachers had been benefiting from We Schools programming, We Charity school programming on service learning. It's gone in Canada and no one talked about it. And that just blew my mind.
I think for me, one of the interesting, because I've actually followed the We Charity for about 20 years, because I used to do work at lobbying at the United Nations, and I remember them in the early 2000s, late 90s coming to, and I was like, oh, look, Canada's really taking a center stage here. This is great. And I followed some of their activities. I think it was maybe a perfect storm. You had many folks at home forcibly because COVID, lockdowns, and people, for some reason, really paying attention to news. Not for some reason, but for good reason, because, is there a lockdown? What is the outbreak numbers? What's going on with COVID? And then all of a sudden, this inserted the news cycle. But I think what piqued a lot of people's interest is that the government was, again, awarding a close to $1 billion contract to some third-party charity. And I think people didn't know that. Is that done? Is that typical? So I guess I'll ask you, is that typical of governments? You've worked with many organizations. Is that typical for a government to award a contract of that size? And was it, and I think that it raised a lot of eyebrows, and maybe should it not have?
Well, it's a great question. So let me tell you a couple of things about that. One thing is you said $1 billion contract. It's very interesting. It was actually only 543 million. And the interesting fact is that many politicians called it a $900 million or $1 billion contract. It's completely false. But yet you will see thousands of references to it over and over again because people wanted the soundbite, $1 billion program, because
Sorry,
it
but
sounded worse.
But I mean, that was reported widely. It was 940 million. So you're saying that is actually categorically false?
It's just categorical.
Wow.
It's not even a little bit true. But more importantly, and a great anecdote in the book is the Globe and Mail's editor, Sylvia Steed. There was a request from We Charity they sent to her a request saying, please stop reporting the number falsely. Can you at least report the number accurately? And she responds in an email that I cite in the book, where she says, well, I've Google researched it, and 912 million comes up more times than 543, so we're going to stick with our reporting. And you sort of pause and say, wow, that's the Globe and Mail's criteria for whether it's true or false. That's amazing. And it was just about a soundbite. So even though every politician on the right and left of the political spectrum knew that it was not a $900 million program, you will find Charlie Angus in the NDP and Pierre Poilievre constantly using the number, knowing it's false, to try and create a certain impression.
Tawfiq, right before we went to commercial break, we were chatting that actually the number of this, contract that was awarded to We Charity, you're right. We all assumed, because we read in multiple media sources, that it was 912 million. We're in fact wrong. It's false. How much was the contract for? 540, was it?
543 million. And remember, that's not even the contract. That's the amount that was being spent on this program. Right. None of it, of course, was going to We Charity. We Charity was not going to make a nickel off this program. We Charity was just administering the program and being reimbursed for whatever administrative costs it had to incur to get 100,000 people these jobs. Now, of course, the program never happened in the end. And sadly, all 100,000 students in Canada got nothing as a result of this political controversy, which is, part of the story of loss here.
Well, okay, let's talk about those losses. Again, for the innocent bystander passing by a newspaper stand, reading the headlines, it really did look like there would be a finger pointed at We Charity saying, you've done something wrong here. But based on what you're sharing with me, they were just political capital in expendable political capital in a game between political insiders and political parties. What has happened since? It's been 2 years. There was the ethics investigation. What were the results of that investigation, and what has happened now to We Charity?
Yeah, well, I think the saddest part of this whole story for me is that, and as a board member, it was really tragedy, was We Charity in Canada was forced to shut its doors, to sell all of its assets to help continue to fund its overseas programs where it had made commitments to communities across the world to help with sustainable development efforts. And, it just became a bit of a toxic brand in Canada where it became impossible to continue to raise money and do the work that had been done. And We Charity closed down in Canada. It's still active in the US with a much smaller footprint. And there are still good work being done by many of the people who were associated with We Charity. But I think the real profound tragedy is that many people, when they looked at the story, all of them basically saying, oh, well, We Charity must have done something wrong. Why is it in the news all the time? But they can't articulate what it is. And I sort of try to help here. And one of the things is that the media and politicians, they were very quick to say, act like We Charity is some name on a building. We Charity is two brothers named Kilberger. But behind all of that, we're millions of children. We're tens of thousands of women working in empowerment centers around the world. We're generations of teachers who had been using We Charity materials to help educate young people and make them more civic minded and make them contributors to our society. And you can't malign We Charity without talking about those people or talking to those people or offering their perspective. And yet that's exactly what happened. And I think for me, that was the saddest and most shocking part of the We Charity scandal. And in many ways, I start the book this way. I say, my effort is to really show you who was scandalized and who did the scandalizing. Because if you realize what was lost, you're going to ask hard questions. I think most fair-minded people will say, was this really worth it? Does this make sense? Particularly when We Charity was ultimately found to have engaged in no misconduct, violated no laws, no rules. After 8 separate government investigations, they did nothing wrong. And even the Trudeau government, Trudeau was exonerated. So if you think about it, it's kind of amazing. I say at the end, We Charity was destroyed, but Trudeau got reelected with the same majority, so he was untouched. The chief antagonists of We Charity, like Pierre Poilievre, well, he's the leader of the Conservative Party.
Right.
Charlie Angus on the NDP side, who was the other chief antagonist, also very popular and has lifted his profile. So in some ways, the only people who got hurt were children and teachers.
My goodness. Okay, well, we've uncovered a lot of information today. We only have about 30 seconds left. Let's wrap it up with a comment on the media. What should people be demanding from the media or journalists then going forward when reporting a story?
Well, I think the important thing is to demand that people engage in investigative journalism. And if you're going to report something, you're going to have done all the work and you're going to have given the subject of that reporting an opportunity to comment and provide you with information. And I'll just give you one example. The last chapter of my book is called The Fifth Estate. And it's because the CBC's reporting in the Fifth Estate, very reputable. Most people would think they've done their homework. But what you discover is that CBC ran 2 documentaries, and they're just filled with things that are not true, that are demonstrably false. Even the people who appeared in the program have signed an open letter to the CBC and published in the newspaper saying it's demonstrably false. And yet the CBC wouldn't correct it or do the work. And so I think what we have to do as Canadians is really hold our media to high standards and say, look, if you make mistakes, you need to own up to it. And if I find out that you've engaged in false journalism, I'm not reading your publication, I'm not watching it anymore.
Definitely an eye-opening conversation on what role the media play in a story, and perhaps, as our guest said, that sometimes there's only smoke and perhaps there is no fire. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.